It's good to be here in Owensboro. It's a great little park. I titled my speech today, "Who Killed the Constitution? How did we let it die? And can it be resuscitated?" Now, those sound like pretty dramatic words. Who killed the Constitution? Do we still have a Constitution? Do we still have a republic? Or what have we become? When Ben Franklin walked out of the Constitutional Convention, the people gathered asked, "What have we gotten?" They weren't sure if we'd gotten a monarchy or a democracy or a republic. And Ben Franklin said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." There is a difference, and I know there are a lot of kids here, and I'm going to try to give them, well, I guess I've already lost their attention. That's too late. But for all the kids and for the adults here, I think the most important lesson, and this is just not for kids, most adults have lost this lesson. Most of our politicians don't know the difference. You must start by knowing the difference between a republic and a democracy. Our founding fathers would be horrified to have people go around and say America's a democracy. They feared democracy. The difference is that a constitutional republic has democratic voting. We get representatives who represent us in Washington or at our state level, but those representatives are restrained by a document, by the Constitution. Jefferson understood this. Jefferson said democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people could decide the rights of the other 49%. I tell people in our country now, if they say, "Oh, well, we're a democracy and that's good, that's republic, that's just old-fashioned," well, that would mean 51% of the people could then vote to have no First Amendment, to have no private property, to reinstitute slavery. We have what are called inalienable rights. They talk about God-given rights, natural rights. These are things that precede government and precede people, and these are important, but we've lost our way in this country. We now live, I think, in almost a pure democracy. There are congressmen who say that there are two arguments that are never heard and will never be listened to in Washington. If you're on the House floor, if you come up with a moral argument or a constitutional argument, you're virtually laughed out of the premises because they do not have any regard for the Constitution anymore. And some say, well, what do you mean by that? What does that practically mean, that they don't believe in the Constitution anymore, that we're a democracy? Well, the majority just votes. Whoever's the power votes in and they do what they want to do. For example, here's a practical application. We have an enormous deficit right now. It's getting bigger and bigger, and I think it's going to swallow us and our children. The deficit next year will be 13% of the gross national product. This is the largest deficit we've ever had in our history. The money supply went up in the last 6 months greater than at any time in our history. The repercussions of what we are doing will be profound. But how does the Constitution come into play? The Constitution doesn't allow for most of the things they do in Washington. Probably 80 to 90% of what goes on in Washington is unconstitutional. The Constitution enumerated certain powers. Those powers not enumerated, meaning those powers not named, are to be left with the people. That's the 9th and 10th Amendment. We completely ignore the 9th and 10th Amendment. We have other amendments. The 4th Amendment, supposed to prevent you from having unreasonable search and seizure. It's one of the reasons we fought the Revolution, because the British soldiers were coming into the colonialist house willy-nilly without warrants, or warrants that were signed by a military officer. We're doing that in our country again. We need to obey the Constitution. If we were to obey the Constitution and the federal government only performed its enumerated powers, things like education wouldn't be done at all at the federal level. Now people will respond and they're aghast, "You're against education." Well, no. Even now, most funding for education, if you watch your tax dollars, is done by property taxes and done locally. It's only in the last 20 years we've added on the Department of Education, and many mainstream Republicans oppose the Department of Education. Reagan ran for getting rid of it. But the Republicans lost their way, as well as the Democrats. They haven't listened to their own message, and they haven't fulfilled their own message. And it's why there are a lot of groups that spring up, the Tea Party movement, groups like this, which are nonpartisan, and I don't think necessarily Republican or Democrat, but who believe in the Constitution, are springing up because they aren't seeing anyone answer this message on the Republican side or the Democrat side. I think that means that there is a vacuum, the people are hungry, and we have to do something about it. But there is no federal mandate for education. It should all be done at the state and local level. People should be left alone. Almost every federal program you can point to, there is no constitutional mandate for it. Many of this was created by an interpretation of what they call the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause says that the federal government can regulate trade between the states. But you know, the original interpretation of the Commerce Clause was to prevent there from being trade barriers between the states. They didn't want Kentucky to have a tariff to prevent trade with Indiana or Illinois. So it was done to facilitate trade, but now we have the federal government using the Commerce Clause to come in and say they can do anything they want. One of the famous cases was back in the 1940s, Wickard v. Filburn, and there was a guy who wanted to just grow some 20 acres of wheat. And the government said, and this is when they got all these crazy programs right after the Depression where they pay you not to grow food, and said, no, you can only grow 10 acres. And he said, well, I'm going to feed it all to my own livestock. I'm not even going to sell it. Well, they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and he grew 20 acres of corn that year, and they said he could only grow 10. He consumed all of it on his property in California, and they said, no, that's interstate commerce because by not selling it, you're affecting the price of interstate corn. Well, that's just ridiculous that a Supreme Court and smart people ostensibly could say that, but that is the opening that they drive the truck, the huge behemoth of federal government goes through the opening of the Commerce Clause. So for a while they pretend that they do have a constitutional reason, but they've changed it from what it was originally intended to do. I think it's important that you have laws. People talk about living under the rule of law rather than the rule of man. The rule of law restrains people and it gives us guidance. It is a very important document, the Constitution, and we completely ignore it. But we ignore it at our own peril. What is coming is something I think we may not even be able to imagine what is coming. The deficit is so big as a percentage of our economy. The money supply is being inflated at such a rapid rate. People say, my kids and my grandkids will be paying for the deficit. And that's true, but I think it's worse than that. I think you may well be paying for the deficit within a year through higher inflation. Could be 20% inflation. We don't know. Could be 25% inflation. Think of the unrest in our country when milk, instead of being $4 a gallon, is $8 a gallon within a one-year period. Those on fixed income and those who are of a lower socioeconomic level, they get hurt the worst by inflation. As inflation hits the working class, it wreaks havoc because your wages will not keep up with inflation. It's all a consequence of the deficit. It's a simple message, but we have to get it out there, and we don't have a deficit if we pay attention to the rule of law, if we pay attention to the Constitution. I'll give you another example of how we're ignoring the rule of law. Recently, Chrysler went bankrupt. It's always sad, and if anybody works for Chrysler, it's sad that they have to lose their job, but it happens within the economy. When it does, though, we have rules for bankruptcy. In our country, for 100 years, we've had rules for bankruptcy, and there are people who are preferred shareholders, there are people who wait second in line, and then there are people who own stock or workers, and they're last in line. That's just the rules. What we've done now is President Obama and the administration have come in and said, the rules are out. We now live under President Obama's rules, and his rules say the preferred bond shareholders, and they try to describe them and vilify them as these evil rich people, but you know who they were? It was the teacher's pension of Indiana. The teacher's pension of Indiana held Chrysler stock, and they were promised that they would be